The bus driver dropped them off at an unremarkable, nameless bus stop, a sight that immediately alarmed them. Was this even where they were supposed to be? "Mum, is this our stop? And where's the village? Why can't we see any houses?" Madeline asked in surprise. In response, Roberta looked at the chauffeur, who helped her out of the bus.
"Yes, it's the right village, don't doubt it. I've been on this route for years. You need to go along this dirt road now, and then it's just a short walk to the village," the man explained.
Roberta thanked him for his help and exhaled with relief, setting the suitcases on the sun-warmed asphalt. Travelling in reality was much more difficult than it seemed from the doctor's office. They had spent about 4 hours on the road, tired and demoralised by recent events, an extremely painful divorce, an unfair dismissal from her job, and hasty preparations to move, all within a tight time frame that gave Roberta herself a headache. Since Madeline had slept most of the way, Roberta had stayed awake to watch over her. Every time they hit a bump or pothole, the bus shuddered, making Roberta worry every time her daughter didn't fall. The bus doors clanked loudly as the driver started the engine and smoothly pulled away, leaving the travellers in a cloud of exhaust fumes. "Well, my dear, shall we go?" Roberta suggested, glancing at the departing bus. "Yes, Mum, of course. We'll go. Before it gets dark. I'm afraid of wolves," the little girl said, looking around warily. Madeline had finished second grade just a couple of months ago, yet she reasoned like an adult. Roberta smiled and replied in her usual joking manner, "Don't worry, sunshine. There might be wolves here, but we're far from the forest. Don't think about it. Everything will be fine, I promise." Joyful sparkles appeared in the girl's eyes. "Really? Well, let's go quickly then. Do you know if our house will be big or not so big?" Roberta shrugged uncertainly. "Oh, I wish I knew. I inherited it by chance, a kind patient's gift." Taking the suitcases in both hands, she walked down the dirt road the chauffeur had indicated. Madeline obediently followed, kicking up clouds of dust with her little feet. Since the settlement was on a hill, they had to walk upward continuously. After about 600 meters, Roberta finally exhausted herself and set the suitcase on the ground. "My strength is definitely not enough," she thought wistfully, barely keeping on her feet from such a load. "Mum, are you tired? Why don't I carry it?" Madeline suggested, concern in her voice. Roberta looked at her daughter with a smile. "How could you carry it? It weighs more than you do." At that moment, Roberta suddenly heard a strange noise behind her. "What is that? A motorcycle? No, it's much louder and it's humming. A car! My God, it's a car!" Roberta thought. To her surprise, when she turned around, she saw a distinctive car with a taxi sign. "A cab? Who would call a cab in such backwoods?" she whispered. "Mum, could it be a car coming for us?" Madeline asked hopefully. "No. Who would send a cab for us? There's no one." Meanwhile, the car in a cloud of dust pulled up to the tired travellers. The cab driver stopped and, opening the passenger door, said, "I can give you a lift to the village if you need it. Have a seat, and I'll load the suitcases." Roberta exchanged a questioning look with Madeline, then decided to accept the offer. Taking the front seat, she put her daughter in the back and closed the door. In no time, the tall cab driver had stowed their suitcases in the trunk. "Let's go, shall we? I'm Jason." The driver introduced himself and started the engine. "Roberta, and this is my daughter Madeline," replied the passenger, slightly embarrassed. The cab driver nodded, and his conspicuous yellow car roared to life, driving towards the village. To pass the time, Roberta cautiously asked, "Are you on a call?" The driver smiled. "Yes, I'm taking medicines to the paramedic station. They've equipped a medical centre in the village, and I was hired as a courier to pick up medicine from the pharmacy warehouse. It's much more convenient, especially since I've made this trip before." "Oh, a paramedic station, that's impressive." "I wouldn't have thought so. It's just a village." Does it even have its own medical officer? Roberta remarked, respect in her voice.
Well, how could it be otherwise? There isn't a single medical point in the whole country, and you can't easily go to the district clinic. You need transportation here.
There's just one problem. The doctor is a retired man, Mr. McCourt.
He's 80 years old, but still at his post. Unfortunately, he's taken ill with sciatica. There's no one to see patients.
The cab driver replied, keeping his eyes on the road. Roberta nodded sympathetically and looked out the window. On both sides of the road stretched endless yellow fields and sparse forest belts, which gradually merged into a dense forest.
"Where are you headed anyway? What's the address?" the cab driver asked again.
Roberta flinched, then pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse. Unfolding it, she read the address. "Do you know where it is?" The driver hit the brakes in surprise, and the car came to an abrupt halt. "Jason, what's wrong? Is something the matter?" she asked anxiously. The driver looked at her with surprise and said,
"Are you sure? You're not confused?"
"Well, yes. What's there to confuse? It's written clearly in black and white." The cab driver shook his head apologetically. "You must have been given the wrong address. At that location is the paramedic station, where I'm delivering medicine for Mr. McCourt." Roberta gasped in surprise. "A paramedic station? But there must be a house there. I inherited it from Douglas Hurst. I have the documents I can show you." Jason glanced at the passenger with a hint of irony.
"I believe you, but why show me those documents? I wouldn't understand them anyway."
Roberta bit her lip with resentment and turned to the window. This was unexpected news. She had such hopes for this house. Now where could she go? All because of her unfaithful husband Neil, who had thrown her and her daughter out after the divorce to indulge in pleasures with a young mistress. Soon the village came into view. Roberta immediately spotted the house she sought on the outskirts. As it turned out, the cab driver was right. The house, given to Roberta in the will, indeed housed a medical centre. "How did it happen? Is there a mistake in the documents?" she thought glumly. Meanwhile, Jason stopped the car at the gate, which bore a red cross painted on it. "Mum, are we going to live in the hospital?" Madeline asked cautiously. Roberta shrugged uncertainly. "To be honest, I don't know myself, Madeline. I didn't expect it to be like this." After setting Roberta's suitcases in front of the gate, Jason pulled out a small bundle of medical supplies and started banging on the gate. "Hey, anyone there? Delivery's here." Roberta looked around warily. It seemed the entire settlement was watching her every move, despite the fact that the village itself continued its measured, unhurried life. Dogs barked, geese cackled, cows grazed peacefully in a distant pasture, due to return at dusk, driven by the shepherd's calls. Soon after Jason knocked, the front door creaked open. A minute later the gate swung wide, revealing a disgruntled woman of about 30, dressed in a characteristic white medical coat. She eyed the guests hostilely and asked the cab driver, "Hello, Jason. Who are these people? Your acquaintances?" The driver coughed embarrassedly. "No, Brooke. I was passing by and saw Roberta and Madeline walking along the road. I couldn't just leave them." Brooke wrinkled her nose as if in pain. "What do they want here? And where's the promised medicine?" The driver opened his mouth to answer, but Roberta beat him to it. "I've come to my house. Well, not exactly mine, but that doesn't change the point." "Not exactly yours. Are you sure you're not confused?" Brooke questioned. "No, it's all correct. I have the documents right here, notarized and certified," Roberta replied, a bit flustered by her own frankness. "Documents, you say? Well, come in then. You'll need to show these papers to the chairman and Mr. McCourt," Brooke answered, more calmly now. One could easily guess she was a junior medical worker, like a nurse or an orderly. "Well, now that you've sorted it out, I'll be on my way," Jason said. "Here's the medicine. Everything's according to the inventory, and the package seal is intact." He headed for his car as evening was approaching, and he still had to return the taxi to the parking lot. Bye, Jason. Come again. Please, keep in mind," Brooke called out, watching him leave with a fond look.
Oh, Shakespearean passions are at play here. That's why she snapped at me like an angry cat. She must be jealous, Roberta thought, barely suppressing a smile. Only after the cab rounded the corner did Brooke decide to let the guests into the house, though she refused to help Roberta with the suitcases. Roberta smiled but didn't reproach Brooke. Why strain relationships on their first day? Who knew how life could unfold? They might end up working side by side. "Actually, this house is divided in two," Brooke explained as she let them in. "One half is Mr. McCourt's medical centre, the other is living quarters. It was neglected for a long time, then the local chairman renovated it for the doctor to live in, after his house burned down. His son and daughter-in-law live in the other side of the country, so he didn't want to impose. Most likely, your will specifies this residential half of the house." "It's quite cosy, even better than I expected," Roberta remarked cautiously. "You bet it is. They've done quite a renovation at the chairman's expense for Mr. McCourt," Brooke retorted bluntly. Roberta bit her lip, stung by the remark. They certainly weren't rushing to welcome her with open arms. But that was fine. The main thing was that she had finally rid herself of those cumbersome suitcases and could set them down in the hallway.
"Brooke, dear, who's there? Has Jason brought the medicine?"
A man's voice, trembling with weakness, called out.
"Yes and no, Mr. McCourt. It's quite different. Jason's already left, and here are the heirs."
Brooke replied, her tone dripping with disdain for the newcomers. Roberta's indignation left her breathless. How dare this nurse speak to her in such a tone? Didn't she and her daughter deserve some basic respect?
"Heirs are serious business. Let them through. And Brooke, if it's not too much trouble, please make some tea for me and the guests,"
the man replied in the same weak voice. Brooke threw an angry glance in Roberta's direction, as if it were her fault that Mr. McCourt was ill and couldn't attend to his guests himself.
"All right, I'll do it now,"
Brooke replied through gritted teeth. Roberta smiled and entered Mr. McCourt's room. He was a man in his 80s with a wrinkled face and kind grey eyes.
"Hello, dear guests, come in. Tell me, what brings you here?"
The elderly man broke the prolonged silence. Roberta hesitated, then took out a folder from her purse containing the will of the late Mr. Hurst. "Here, the documents, take it," she said. "I'm sorry to be so abrupt, but if not for the circumstances, I would never have come here unannounced." Mr. McCourt smiled, but didn't examine the will, taking Roberta at her word. At 82, he had learned to understand people and immediately realized she was telling the truth. Besides, what reason would this nice woman with a little girl and 2 suitcases have to lie?
"Don't worry. I won't turn you away. Please sit down," said Mr. McCourt. "In fact, it's all my fault things happened this way. This house had been empty for at least 10 years, so I decided to use it for my needs. This half of the house used to belong to Douglas Hurst, my childhood friend, but then he moved to the city and hasn't been here for a decade. So I decided, so to speak, to take over the house myself. If Douglas came back, I'd return it without a word."
"What about the repairs? You've invested so much money and effort here, haven't you?" Roberta asked sceptically. Mr. McCourt waved his hand.
"Come now, what's money? Today you have it, tomorrow you don't. Is that what happiness is about? The important thing is that we've set up a medical centre here. People come to us from all the surrounding areas, and sometimes even from the city. It's just a pity that my health is failing. I'd like a colleague or two to take over, to help in emergencies. I can barely manage on my own. Brooke is a nurse and there's a lot of work to do."
At that moment, Roberta's eyes lit up. "I'm a general practitioner. Maybe I can be of use. Until a week ago, I worked in the therapy department at the city hospital."
Mr. McCourt raised an eyebrow in surprise.
The therapy department, you say? What luck! We desperately need such specialists. Would you consider working for us? Here, I mean. I can't promise a significant salary, as our operation is mostly voluntary, you know. But I'll talk to the chairman. He is an understanding man. I think he can arrange a decent salary for you.
Roberta shook her head. What do you mean? Are you working independently of the local government? Mr. McCourt smiled.
Indeed we are. We work in challenging conditions, providing assistance to the population due to the lack of necessary specialists. Not everyone can afford a trip to the city. Buses don't run often, so we help here and refer to city specialists when needed.
Like my mum? Madeline interjected a bit awkwardly.
Yes, like your mum,
Mr. McCourt replied, addressing her seriously. Roberta looked at the elderly doctor with a smile, struck by a thought. He truly is a good man. While others his age tend to focus on themselves, he's taken the initiative to organise a paramedic station in a village deprived of medical care. Seeing the amazement in Roberta's eyes, Mr. McCourt said,
My dear, make yourself at home. I have 2 free rooms here. I'll live in one until I can find something better, and you and your daughter can have the other. Or both, I won't mind. At my age I've learned not to chase luxuries. I've grown accustomed to living simply, in Spartan conditions, so to speak.
Tears glistened in Roberta's eyes. She had longed for such words of support, especially from men, after enduring many hardships in her life. Mum, when are we going to eat? I'm hungry, Madeline piped up, breaking the poignant silence. Roberta shrugged absent-mindedly, then remembered she had packed sandwiches and tea in a thermos for the journey. The eventful trip, however, had left no time for lunch. How about we all have dinner together? Roberta suggested to the elderly doctor. Mr. McCourt immediately waved his hands in protest.
No, thank you. I've had enough tea. I have no appetite at all, especially with this illness gripping me like a vice. When I was young, I used to go diving, exploring riverbeds, you know. Back then, we called it something else. Foolishly, I spent too much time in the water and developed sciatica. Now, I only see underwater depths on the TV screen, he said with a wistful smile. But perhaps there are new treatments available. Medicine has come a long way. What about ointments or injections? Roberta inquired gently. No, my dear, I don't want any medicine any more. I treat myself more and more with herbs, and I help people because I know that's the most I can do for them, Mr. McCourt said, shaking his head. My son and daughter-in-law live 2,000 kilometres away from me, so I can't travel much. They don't have children yet, but my son says everything will be fine, there's no rush. I once thought there was no need to hurry, but when the threat of childlessness appeared, we all got nervous. Fortunately, I was lucky to have a son, but it's still unclear how they'll fare with children.
At that moment, the door opened, and Brooke appeared with a tray bearing 3 cups of fragrant steaming tea. Here, Mr. Court, help yourself, she said to the elderly doctor, pretending that Roberta and Madeline weren't in the room.
Thank you, Brooke. God grant you health and a good fiancé. You should go out. You must be tired of living alone. It's hard, especially in a house where you can't handle with chores without a man, Mr. McCourt said sympathetically.
Brooke visibly blushed at these words and gave the guests a worried look. Roberta immediately realised that the nurse didn't want her to know about her personal life. However, Roberta had never been overly curious and always avoided gossip or discussing others' shortcomings.
Brooke, why didn't you make tea for yourself?
Mr. McCourt asked, concerned. Oh, no, I don't feel like it. I just had a cup. I'll probably go home. Don't think there'll be any more patients today, Brooke answered with forced calmness. Roberta quickly understood the situation. The nurse simply didn't want to sit at the same table with her. Clearly, Brooke saw her as a rival, though Roberta didn't see it that way. What kind of rival could she be? What could she do to this woman who had lived here since birth? If Roberta's life had been normal, would she have moved to this wilderness with a young daughter? Unlikely. After all, just a couple of weeks ago, she at least had her favourite job. Now she had nothing but half of this small house in the middle of nowhere. Sipping the fragrant, tart tea, Roberta didn't notice how she slipped into sad memories of her past. A whirlpool of events and images swirled around her like a magical kaleidoscope, events appearing in a random order. She had met her future husband, Neil Meeks, at a medical institution, where he was already a successful doctor, and she had just graduated from university and completed her internship. By then, rumours circulated about Neil being a womanizer who didn't miss a single skirt. Naturally, Roberta didn't believe a word from her future colleagues, who warned that Neil would definitely try to get her into bed. And of course this didn't happen immediately, as Roberta, raised on romantic ideals, never rushed things, wanting to thoroughly understand a man's character before letting him into her personal life. Realizing he couldn't get the melancholic beauty so easy, Neil changed tactics and began courting her with the extravagance of someone who could afford it. His parents held high positions in the Ministry of Health and promoted their son relentlessly, eventually securing his appointment as head of the department. Of course, none of the therapy staff doubted that Neil Meeks got his position solely thanks to his parents. They pushed him forward like an icebreaker, carving through Arctic waters. More experienced and qualified doctors had vied for the department head position, but Neil clinched it. While this might seem incredible to some, for the young doctor, conquering this peak was merely one step in his rapidly advancing career. Ironically, his appointment coincided with the start of his relationship with Roberta, who finally reciprocated his advances and began to consider herself his fiancée. Neil visibly tensed at this development, as marriage wasn't in his plans at all. Yet, being with Roberta felt comfortable, and he saw no harm in tying himself to her. Moreover, Roberta was 2 months pregnant, which tipped the scales toward a hasty wedding. Truthfully, Neil had always dreamed of living as a bachelor until 40, childless and free from family obligations. In his fantasies, he saw himself as a dashing knight, conquering women's hearts with enviable regularity. But the news of Roberta's pregnancy changed his life dramatically. Roberta, meanwhile, struggled terribly during her pregnancy. She suffered from morning sickness and dizziness, which drove her mad and prevented her from focusing on anything. Neil offered no support, as expected. When Roberta woke at night with a stomach discomfort, her husband would simply roll over or even leave for another room, turning on the TV at full volume. The situation worsened when Roberta discovered she was carrying twins, which her negligent husband had seen on the ultrasound monitor. Neil then seemed to go off the rails. For reasons incomprehensible to Roberta, he suddenly began working day and night, staying away from home for days at a time. When the woman timidly asked where he disappeared to, her husband simply replied, "Problems, Roberta. They've completely overwhelmed me. The ministry kept calling, they scolded the chief physician, and then he reamed us all out. It's hard work now, not like it used to be." Roberta said anxiously, "You should take a break anyway, or your lack of sleep will harm you. And then there's the food. You know, it can lead to gastritis and ulcers. What could you eat when you don't leave the office for 24 hours? Neil barely suppressed a chuckle and replied, "It's nothing, Roberta, I'll manage. I'll run to the canteen." In reality, he didn't go to any canteen, but spent all his spare time with his mistress. Rumours suggested that by the time his daughter Madeline was born, Neil had 3 mistresses. He managed to juggle several women simultaneously, unburdened by conventions or responsibilities. It so happened that contractions caught Roberta at home, as she had hoped until the last moment that the babies would be born on the date set by the doctors. However, things turned out quite differently. Unfortunately, Neil was not at home, and Roberta had to call an ambulance, which arrived half an hour late due to a heavy snowstorm and ice. Meanwhile, her husband was enjoying himself at a roadside hotel with his mistress, oblivious to his wife's tough time. To avoid disturbances, he had turned off his phone and learned about his daughter's birth only 2 days later. But the most shocking part was yet to come. The first thing Neil asked was, "Why only one girl? Where's the other one? What happened, Roberta? Why aren't you saying anything?" The young mother sobbed softly, then began to cry hysterically. As it happened, the doctors were unable to save both babies, and Roberta's joy at the birth of one daughter was overshadowed by her grief at the loss of the second. The C-section was performed on time, and the surgeon on duty did everything correctly. While this elementary operation seemed harmless, each case is unique, and there's always a risk of complications. Roberta didn't blame her colleagues in the medical field or anyone else. As a therapist herself, she understood that life sometimes puts people in difficult situations. Roberta sobbed, crying all day long, hugging her pillow, until an elderly midwife approached her and took her hand. "Oh, sweetheart, I understand it hurts. I know it hurts a lot, but you must endure. You have to live for your second daughter. Otherwise, while you're here, they'll put her on artificial nutrition. You know, there's nothing more valuable for a baby than mother's milk." Roberta sobbed and pressed her cheek against the shoulder of this wise, kind woman. For some inexplicable reason, after Madeline's birth, Neil grew freezing towards his wife and began to blame her for the second daughter's death. "It's all your fault. If you had gone to the hospital in time, everything would have been fine. What were you waiting for? You should have spent the last 2 weeks at the hospital, but you were drawn to your home." Roberta turned pale, her face changing. "What's that got to do with it? You're not an obstetrician, but the head of the therapeutic department. You have no right to tell me how it would have been better or worse," she replied. Neil grinned. "Well, look, you know, you're always getting requests from the provinces for valuable personnel. I can easily fire you, or even transfer you to some backwater, and I'll definitely send you there if you keep behaving like this." "Do what you want. Send me to the wilderness or the far north. I don't care any more," Roberta replied, tears in her eyes. Neil kept disappearing for 24 hours at a time, turning his life into an endless series of affairs and drinking binges. Now he didn't even hide that he spent his time away from his desk, boasting about his company of long-legged beauties or new, clever nurses. 8 years passed imperceptibly, though they seemed an eternity to Roberta. Day after day, it was the same. Work, home, work. Probably like all mothers. During this time, Roberta managed to enroll Madeline in kindergarten after her maternity leave ended, and then in school. She did all this by herself, with practically no support from her husband. Roberta's in-laws also disliked Madeline and rarely agreed to have their granddaughter visit. At one point, Roberta even thought they considered her granddaughter a stranger or born of another man. But what other man could there have been when she worked side by side with Neil in the same department? It's hard to say how long their life together would have continued if Roberta hadn't met an elderly patient who had been in the clinic for 3 weeks. To her dismay, Mr. Hurst didn't hide the fact that he would likely never leave the medical institution, and therefore treated everything with philosophical calmness and restraint. Roberta got along with him from the first days of their acquaintance. The wise man had lived a hard life and loved to tell stories about his childhood in the remote village. According to him, he still had a house there. Given the seriousness of Mr. Hurst's illness, Roberta realized that it was impossible to cure him. However, she could ease his suffering with care and competently selected drug therapy.
"Thank you, Roberta. You're all I have left. I had a son, but he's gone, the poor soul. He went to prison as a boy and has been behind bars ever since. He'd get out, walk free for a year, and then go back in. Recently I received news that he died in a prison riot. I don't know what happened, but they sent me a coffin with an obituary and just 2 words. They wouldn't even let me open the lid. Of course I cried and mourned, then organised the funeral. As soon as that was done, I came straight here. Then you ran the tests and quickly discovered I was ill. I used to be patient and brave, trying to cure, but now I've realised it was all pointless."
"Come on, Mr. Hurst. You still have a long way to go. I'll prescribe you a new medication, and you'll feel much better. Rest assured, I've dealt with more severe cases than yours." Roberta hastened to reassure him, but it was impossible to deceive a man wise beyond his years. One evening during her shift, he called her over and asked her to sit in the chair beside his bed. Seeing the unspoken question in the doctor's eyes, the elderly patient continued,
"Listen, Roberta, I'm sorry to meddle, but your Neil, the head of the department, he's not a good man. He's cheating on you left and right, and not just with one woman. They don't even know about each other. I'm in the ward every day. I notice everything. I apologise for being so direct. Anyone else in my position would have kept quiet, pretended it wasn't happening, but I can't do that. Leave him. Better yet, run away, and take your daughter with you. I've seen her, Madeline. She's a good girl. She came to visit you at lunchtime once."
Roberta looked at the elderly patient with pity. What else could she say? Mr. Hurst had already voiced what was building up in her soul, like the boiling magma of a volcano. Perhaps she simply lacked the strength to leave her husband and start anew. Not everyone could be a femme fatale with a heart of ice.
"If he had just cheated on you, Roberta, I wouldn't have said anything. But he speaks so nastily about you, ridicules you so much, even in public. Everyone here knows about it, except you. Leave him, honey. Leave him. You can raise the child yourself. You're not stupid. And don't have any more dealings with this bloodsucker."
Mr. Hurst added regretfully, shaking his head. Roberta looked at the elderly man doubtfully. "Where would I go, Mr. Hurst? I have nowhere to live. I live in his house with Madeline. And work? He's my boss, after all. I do as he says. The chain of command still exists." Mr. Hurst pondered for a moment, then said,
"Listen, Roberta, here's the deal. I have a house in the village. I haven't been there for 10 years, but they say it's still standing. It'll last for decades. I want to bequeath it to you so you and your daughter can start a new life. You've treated me like a human being with all your heart. I want to repay kindness with kindness, as my parents taught me in childhood."
After these words, Roberta protested, waving her hands. "No, no, Mr. Hurst, don't do this. How can it be? This is your home port, so to speak. What's it got to do with me? I'm just a single mum from the city." To her sincere regret, it was impossible to change Mr. Hurst's mind. Taking her hand, he quietly added,
"I will give this house only to you and your daughter. No one else deserves it. Of course, you could give it to the state, but I want some memory of me to remain, and I'll wager you a house too. It's a bit far, though, about 3 or 4 hours away, but I think you'll manage."
Roberta shook her head doubtfully. "Well, I don't know, Mr. Hurst, whether I'll manage or not. I'll try, of course, but we'll see. I need to prepare myself too. Madeline's in school, and even though it's vacation now, it's still a new place with new conditions." Mr. Hurst nodded in agreement, then laid his final trump card on the table.
"Don't delay with your resignation, dear. Your husband wants to help you."
"What do you mean, help?" Roberta asked, confused.
He wants to lay you off under some trumped-up charge. I've heard him talking to his subordinates about it, the ones he keeps as his henchmen. So keep your ear to the ground. If they terminate your employment, it'll be much worse than if you quit on your own terms. I'll sign the house over to you anyway. Don't think too long. Get ready and go."
Roberta nodded, not yet knowing this would be their last conversation. To the elderly man's credit, he called a notary that same day and drew up a gift deed. The next morning, Mr. Hurst was gone. Sadly, the elderly patient's departure coincided with the threat he'd warned Roberta about. Neil, having decided to rid himself of his bothersome wife and daughter, had already raised his hand to strike. To start, he publicly accused Roberta of negligence and irresponsibility at work. His wife couldn't tolerate it and immediately protested. "Where do you see my negligence, Dr. Meeks?" Neil grinned smugly.
"Where? Well, for instance, you haven't left Mr. Hurst's room for 24 hours. Were the other patients worse than him? I don't need such useless employees. I want order, not what you've done here. So pack your things and leave."
Barely containing herself, Roberta asked quietly, "What things do I need to pack?" Neil's smile widened.
"What things? Don't play dumb, the ones lying around my house. That's it. We're living apart from now on."
At that moment, Roberta felt as if she'd been doused with ice water. "What do you mean, apart? And Madeline? We've lived together for 8 years."
8 years isn't eternity. Let's not drag this out, shall we? And also I suggest you to start your career in a new place, and better not in this city,"
her husband concluded. Leaving her hated husband's office, Roberta stopped in the middle of the corridor, tears streaming down her face as she sobbed. Instantly, her world had turned upside down. Mr. Hurst was gone, and within hours his most unpleasant warning had come true. At that moment, Roberta realized she had to take the elderly patient's words seriously. She hurriedly packed her belongings and set off for the remote village he had often mentioned. Roberta knew she would have to start her life anew, unsure whether her story would unfold on a pristine, unblemished page or resemble a second grader's messy dictation. Challenges lay ahead, especially in finding work. After all, who needs a doctor in the middle of nowhere? Meanwhile, thanks to his court connections, Neil finalized their divorce in mere days, bypassing the mandatory reflection period. Roberta, however, made a grave mistake. She refused alimony from her despised husband, a decision she would come to regret many times over. Now, sipping fragrant tea, she caught herself thinking about how difficult her first days in the settlement would be.
"What's on your mind, Roberta?" Mr. McCourt asked. "You'll be my assistant, or rather, you'll be the doctor, and I'll be your assistant, as I have no strength left. Thank Douglas for sending such a capable person to our village. God rest his soul."
Roberta hesitated. While she was getting a place to live and work, she realized it might be uncomfortable to share half a house with a child. But then again, what good had come from living in the massive mansion Neil's parents had given them as a wedding gift? In the end, Roberta would never walk through that door again. It was time to live her own life. "Yes, Mr. McCourt, I agree," she said cautiously. "Just give me some time to adapt and learn about your paramedic station."
"Of course, dear. What are you talking about? I completely understand. You probably had different equipment and an office in the city, but here it's rather minimalist, you see. We're hoping for sponsors. Maybe some philanthropist will help. But just think how much help we'll bring to people."
Mr. McCourt smiled. His pleasant voice had a calming effect, fostering a kind and positive mood. Only the nurse, Brooke, seemed to dislike Roberta at first sight. Initially, Roberta mistakenly believed that Brooke's jealousy extended not only to the cab driver Jason, but also to the elderly doctor. However, it wasn't jealousy in the literal sense. More likely, Brooke simply wanted to be the first in everything, and Roberta's appearance threatened her status as the premier figure in village medicine. Naturally, a nurse was always subordinate to an experienced doctor, as Roberta had a diploma and extensive medical knowledge. While Roberta could perform minor procedures like injections, IVs, blood pressure readings, or blood sugar tests, Brooke couldn't compare to a doctor-therapist overall. She envied Roberta and saw her as a rival, an outsider trying to assert herself at others' expense. A week passed. Roberta quickly became involved in the work, soon becoming Mr. Court's right hand. They worked tirelessly for the common good, helping everyone in the village, young and old alike. Sometimes, when in a reflective mood, Mr. McCourt would reminisce about the old days when he and Douglas were classmates. Living next door to each other, they used to play soccer, go fishing, and swim in the river. Lately, after their military service, Douglas moved to the city, while Mr. McCourt stayed in the village. Rumours suggested that a full-fledged district hospital once existed here, but over time funding ceased and the building stood empty. The hospital was disbanded, and the equipment was relocated to the district centre.
"I was distressed at the time," Mr. McCourt recalled. "I kept saying, 'How can this be? The village will wither away.' As a promising doctor, I was offered a position in the region, but I decided to stay here. For a while I worked as an ambulance paramedic, then saw patients at home. When I retired, I realised we needed to open a medical station to help people, especially those living in such a remote area who can't easily reach the district clinic."
Roberta nodded. "Yes, you're right. I agree completely. You're doing a wonderful thing. I can't think of anything better. And it's true, getting to the district centre is no easy task."
Mr. McCourt smiled. "The roads here are so bad, so it's hard for car and bus drivers, though Jason is a golden boy. He and his older sister were orphans. You probably don't even know that Jason doesn't live alone, do you?"
"Who does he live with? Married, I suppose?" Roberta asked casually.
"No, he isn't, Roberta. Jason is raising his nephew, his late sister's son. She and her husband were killed in an accident, and the boy was at risk of ending up in an orphanage, so Jason took him under his guardianship. Now Tommy goes to kindergarten, and Jason drives a cab in his spare time. When their schedules don't align, he has to hire a nanny. You know, it takes a lot of money, so I try to help in any way I can. I give him work. I even got him a courier job for us," Mr. McCourt replied.
Frankly, Roberta was shocked by the elderly doctor's story. She had always thought Jason was just an ordinary cab driver, making ends meet as best he could, but now she saw the man in a different light. In a candid and intimate conversation with Mr. Court, Roberta learned that a year ago, Brooke and Jason had been seriously preparing for their wedding, which was to take place in just a couple of weeks. But Brooke left him after he decided to formalise the guardianship of his nephew. In a heated moment, the woman told Jason that she found the constantly crying baby unpleasant. The man reacted calmly, avoiding any drama or scandal. He simply packed his things and disappeared into the night with the baby. When the angry veil lifted from the young nurse's eyes, she regretted her words and repeatedly begged Jason for forgiveness. But the young man never forgave her. Deep down, he realised he could never again trust her. Roberta and Jason felt a mutual attraction and sympathy from the moment they met, which Brooke disliked. She tried every trick to prevent their communication. However, since Roberta was her boss, Brooke could only harm her in small ways, attempting to make the new doctor look unpleasant. Jason seemed not to notice and continued to communicate with Roberta, growing fonder of her by the day. Watching their interactions, Mr. McCourt smiled and mentally thanked fate for sending him such a clever assistant. Little did he know that the late Mr. Hurst had done this intentionally, killing two birds with one stone. helping an unhappy mother escape an unfaithful husband, and providing his favourite village with a highly qualified doctor. At first, Roberta resented Mr. Hurst for not telling her the house was originally divided into 2 parts, but over time she realised that the settlement was truly the best place on earth. On weekends, she walked with Madeline and Jason by the river, picked mushrooms in the forest, and enjoyed nature. During these moments, Roberta recalled how sad and dreary she felt, spending weekends with her ex-husband Neil, who was always preoccupied with something. Brooke, on the other hand, grew annoyed and secretly wept when she saw Roberta and Jason spending time together. Once, the cunning nurse even complained about Roberta directly to Mr. Court, claiming she spoke ill of him. But the elderly doctor immediately saw through Brooke's attempt to turn him against his colleague.
Brooke, I don't believe a word you're saying. I'm sorry, but jealousy and envy are not admirable qualities. Get over it. Let Jason go. He's no longer yours.
We'll see about that, Brooke muttered, slamming the door loudly as she left. 6 months passed imperceptibly. Roberta and Jason grew so close that they considered themselves a couple. Despite Brooke's intrigues, their relationship strengthened daily, filling their hearts with love and mutual respect. One day, in desperation, Brooke planted a lipstick in Jason's car, knowing full well that Roberta didn't use makeup. She hoped her rival would notice the foreign object and become angry, but Roberta merely laughed and tossed the lipstick in the trash, leaving Brooke to lament the loss of her expensive cosmetics. A month later, Roberta learned that Neil had become a defendant in a criminal case involving large bribes and fraud at the city hospital. A large-scale investigation resulted in the removal of not only the head doctor, but almost all department heads implicated in the abuse of power. Soon after, a new chief physician visited the village and offered Roberta the vacant position of department head back in the city. She looked at him with surprise and shook her head. "No, I'm sorry, I'm not going anywhere. I'm happy here." Mr. McCourt intervened.
Roberta, wait, don't be hasty. Maybe you should reconsider. It's such a great career opportunity.
But Roberta smiled firmly. "No, I'll stay here." At that moment, Brooke held her breath, imagining Roberta packing up and returning to the city, leaving Mr. McCourt and Jason in her care. But Roberta's decision to stay, no matter what, dashed Brooke's hopes. Roberta steadfastly refused the guest's offer. Now the young woman had found her place in the province and didn't want to leave what she had grown to love. Suddenly, something clicked in Brooke's mind. Catching up with the head doctor on the street, she quietly asked, "Dr. Marsh, would you consider taking me on as a nurse? I've been working here in the province for 4 years, and I'd like to move to the city for better living arrangements and career opportunities." Dr. Marsh raised an eyebrow in surprise, then looked to Mr. McCourt, who was standing on the porch of the medical station.
"Colleague, may I take Brooke with me?"
The elderly doctor nodded.
"Of course. Brooke is a worthy employee, diligent and very capable. You won't regret hiring her."
From that day on, Roberta and Brooke never crossed paths again. Rumour had it that Brooke's ambition so impressed the new head doctor that within 3 months he proposed to the beauty from the province. Ironically, around the same time, Jason and Roberta tied the knot in a small, modest ceremony at a church in a neighbouring village. The celebration of this momentous event was attended by inhabitants from several nearby villages, each eager to congratulate their favourite doctor who had treated them at least once. Looking at the newlyweds' joyful faces, Mr. McCourt smiled and silently thanked his childhood friend Douglas, who had changed their lives for the better and given them an invaluable specialist devoted to her work with heart and soul.